There is a building 2 blocks from where I am sitting right now, and the family that built it has not owned the ground beneath it for almost 200 years. They never sold that ground. They never bought it back. They simply lease it, and the rent has been climbing the whole time. I am a financial historian, and I read old property records for a living. What I am about to walk you through is not legal advice, and I am not your attorney. It is history. But once you see how the oldest money in New York actually holds land, you stop looking at a deed the same way. Most people think the goal is to own the house. The people who built this city decided the house was the part you give away. So who keeps the part that matters? And why has nobody told you the difference? Let me take you back to 1784. A young German immigrant named John Jacob Astor steps off a ship in New York with a few flutes to sell and almost nothing else. He goes into the fur trade first, then into something quieter and far more durable. He starts buying land on the island of Manhattan when it is still mostly farms, orchards, and dirt roads north of the settled town. Lots that nobody important wanted. He pays small sums for parcels that sit empty and he waits. I have spent afternoons in the archives with the old conveyance ledgers, the leather ones with the ink gone brown, and you can watch his name appear again and again on the buy side, almost never on the sell side. By the 1830s and into the 1840s, Astor has stopped acting like a buyer of single lots and started acting like a landlord of a city that has not finished being built. This is the part the textbooks skip. He does not put up the buildings himself, not most of them. He owns the ground and he hands out the right to build to other people. The instrument he uses is the ground lease. A builder gets the use of the land for a long stretch of years, often 99, and in exchange, he pays Astor rent and constructs the building at his own cost. When the lease runs out, the land comes back to the Astor estate, and so does whatever is standing on it. There is a story people tell about Astor near the end of his life, and whether or not every word of it is true, it captures the thinking exactly. He was asked, supposedly, whether he had any regrets about his fortune. His answer was that his only regret was that he had not bought more of Manhattan. He had owned a fortune in land and still wished he had owned more dirt. That is not the answer of a man who saw land as a thing to flip for a profit. It is the answer of a man who understood that the ground under a growing city is a position you hold, not a trade you close. I have sat with that line many times in the archives because it is the whole philosophy compressed into a single sentence. The buildings come and go, the island does not. I want you to sit with how strange that is the first time you read it in a real lease. The builder spends his own money putting up a structure on dirt he will never own. He is improving someone else's asset. To most people, that sounds backward. To Astor, it was the whole point. The dirt does not wear out, the building does. Tenants and merchants paid rent to the man who put up the storefront, and that man paid ground rent to Astor. And the rent that flowed up to the Astor estate was tied to the land, which only grew scarcer as the city pressed north and filled in around it. There is a quiet trick of language buried in all of this, and it is the thing almost nobody is taught: the difference between a freehold and a leasehold. When you buy a house in the ordinary way, you are buying a freehold. You own the land and whatever sits on it, in theory, forever. A leasehold is the right to use land for a set term after which it returns to the owner. The Astors structured their world so that they held the freehold and everyone else held leaseholds. They kept the thing that lasts. They leased out the thing that decays. The antagonist in this story is not a person. It is that one distinction hidden inside dull paperwork that decides who is building wealth and who is renting the illusion of it. So let me name the model plainly, because once it has a name, you will see it everywhere. The mechanism is the ground lease, and the structure around it is land ownership separated from building ownership. The landowner keeps the dirt. He leases that dirt to a builder for a long term, classically 99 years. The builder constructs at his own expense, operates the building, and pays ground rent to the landowner the entire time. The rent is set to step up at intervals, so it compounds across decades. At the end of the term, the land and the building both revert to the landowner. Call it the Astor leasehold model. The family did not invent the ground lease. They industrialized it across an entire island. Now contrast that with how you and almost everyone you know buys property. You find a house. You borrow most of the price from a bank. You spend the next 30 years paying that loan. And during those 30 years, you pay property tax, insurance, a new roof, a new furnace, repairs that never end. At the close of it, you own a single structure on a single lot. And that structure has been quietly aging the whole time. The land may have appreciated, which is real and worth something, but you carried every cost of the decaying part, the building, and you carried it alone. The Astor model flips the burden. The landowner pushes the cost of construction and upkeep onto the builder and keeps the appreciating part, the land, for himself. Let me walk the mechanism step by step so it is concrete. First, the landowner holds a parcel and does not develop it. Second, he signs a ground lease handing the builder the right to occupy and build for, say, 99 years. Third, the builder finances and erects the building because the land alone gave him nothing to use until he did. Fourth, the builder runs the building, collects rent from shops and tenants, and out of that pays ground rent up to the landowner. Fifth, the ground rent is written to rise on a schedule every 21 years in many older New York leases, sometimes reset to a percentage of the land's reappraised value. Sixth, when the term ends, the land returns to the owner, and any building still on it returns with it, often with no payment owed. The landowner has financed nothing and owns more than when he started. This is not a loophole someone dreamed up. It rests on ordinary property law that has existed for centuries. A leasehold estate and a freehold estate are both recognized forms of holding real property. New York courts have enforced 99-year ground leases for a very long time, and you can still find ein Act of ground Manhattan today. Some of them under buildings whose names you would know. The reversion, the landowner's right to take back the land and improvements at the end of the term is a basic doctrine. None of this is secret in the legal sense. It is simply technical, and technical things rarely make it into the conversation about how to build wealth. But I told you at the start I would never sell you anything. And that means I have to give you the catch, because there is a real one. The ground lease and the land trust thinking behind it are slow. The wealth shows up across decades, not quarters. Land held this way is illiquid. You cannot turn it into cash in a week the way you might sell shares. The legal structuring costs real money up front. And the long horizon means the person who sets it up is frequently not the person who collects the reward. John Jacob Astor was building for grandchildren he would never meet. If your planning horizon is 3 years, none of this fits your life. So here is the question to hold while I tell you what the family actually did with it. If the structure only pays off across generations, what kind of family stays patient enough to let it work? And what did that patience build? The answer sits in the decades after the old man died in 1848. He left the bulk of the New York real estate to his son, William Backhouse Astor. And William did something that tells you everything about the family's discipline. He did not cash out, he expanded. Through the 1850s and 1860s, while other fortunes were made and lost in railroads and speculation, William Backhouse Astor poured money back into Manhattan land and into the buildings that sat on Astor ground. People in the city started calling him the landlord of New York, and it was not a compliment so much as a plain description. He was said to own several hundred buildings outright and to hold the ground under hundreds more, collecting rents from a slice of the island that grew more valuable every year the population climbed. Walk the numbers with me because the scale is the point. John Jacob Astor died with an estate estimated at around $20 million at a time when that figure was almost beyond imagining the largest fortune in the country. The great majority of it was Manhattan land. William Backhouse Astor took that base and roughly doubled it over his own lifetime, and he did it largely by holding what he inherited and adding to it, not by selling. The family's instruction to itself, repeated across generations, was simple and brutal in its patience. Buy land, lease it, do not sell it. Let the rent compound. Let the term run. Take back the building. Lease it again. I have read enough of the old leases to tell you how it worked in a single block. The estate would own the lots along a stretch of a commercial street downtown. It would lease individual lots to merchants and developers who would put up cast iron storefronts and warehouses at their own expense. The merchant paid ground rent to the Astors year after year, with the rent stepping up at the appointed intervals. If a merchant failed, the lease and the building he had paid for fell back to the estate, which simply leased it to the next tenant. The Astors took on almost no construction risk. They carried no mortgage on those buildings. They held the one thing that does not burn down, flood, or go out of fashion, the ground, and they let everyone else take the risks of the structures above it. Consider one ordinary lot to make the arithmetic real. Say the estate had paid a few $100s for parcel in the 1820s when it was on the edge of the settled town. By the 1860s, the city had grown straight over it, and a merchant was paying the estate a few $1,000s a year in ground rent on that same lot, with another step up scheduled for the following decade. The estate had spent nothing on the building standing on it because the merchant had paid for that. It had spent nothing maintaining the building because that too was the merchant's obligation under the lease. The original few $100s of land was now throwing off thousands a year, indefinitely, with the principal asset still owned and still appreciating. Multiply that across hundreds of lots, and you understand why the family did not need to gamble on railroads or stocks. The island itself was the engine, and they had bought the engine cheap and refused to sell a single part of it. The family also did something with the rent that compounded the advantage. They did not spend most of it. They plowed a large share of the ground rent income back into buying still more land and into the buildings the estate chose to own directly. Income from leased dirt bought more dirt. That is the quiet flywheel underneath the whole story. Most fortunes are spent down by the second or third generation because the heirs treat the money as a fountain to drink from. The Astor instruction treated the rent as seed, not as spending money, at least for the part of the family that managed the estate. Land produced rent, rent bought land, and the cycle ran for the better part of a century before the fortune finally began to disperse. There is a detail I find quietly remarkable. As the city's commercial center marched north over the 19th century, from the old downtown up toward Midtown, the Astor land sat that directly in its path because the family had bought across so much of the island decades earlier. Land they had leased out as marginal lots became some of the most valuable commercial ground in the world simply by waiting under the city's growth. They did not have to predict exactly where the city would go. They had bought enough of the island that wherever it went, it tended to grow over Astor ground. The lease structure meant that every wave of new building, paid for by other people, eventually flowed back to the estate. By the time the family reached its Gilded Age peak, the names on the great houses and hotels were Astor names, but the engine underneath was still the same dull ground lease the old immigrant had used in the 1830s. The mansions and the social ambitions were the visible part, the part the newspapers wrote about. The invisible part, the part that paid for all of it, was a portfolio of land leased out under long terms across the island, throwing off rent that rose with the city. The family that arrived with flutes to sell ended the century owning the ground a large part New York stood on. And they had done it by refusing, almost as a matter of religion, to sell the dirt. Now, let me bring this down to your kitchen table because I think the contrast is where it actually becomes useful. When a regular person sets out to build wealth through property, the plan is almost always the same. Buy a house in your own name, maybe later buy a second one to rent out. Hold them as long as you can. It is a decent plan, and it has built real security for a lot of families. But look at the differences from what the Astors did, because the differences are not small. First, you buy the building, not just the land. So you carry the cost and the decay of the structure for as long as you own it. The roof, the systems, the repairs, all of it lands on you. If you have owned a home for 30 years, you already know this in your bones. You have replaced the furnace. You have replaced the roof. You have paid for the water heater twice. Every one of those was you paying to keep the decaying part standing. Second, you hold it in your own name, which means it is fully exposed. It is exposed to a lawsuit, to a long illness, and the nursing home costs that can come with it, to a divorce, to whatever a court might reach for. Many older Americans discover this the hard way when a single medical event puts the family home in the path of a bill. Third, when you die, that house has to pass through probate, the public court process for settling an estate, which costs money, takes months or longer, and is open for anyone to read. Your children inherit a delay and a lawyer's bill before they inherit the house. Fourth, because it is in your name and tied to your lifespan, the planning horizon is your life. It rarely reaches past it in any structured way, and so the wealth tends to stop and scatter at the exact moment it should keep moving forward. The Astors did the opposite on every point. They separated the land from the building and kept the land. They never held the great assets as exposed individuals, but inside estate structures designed to survive any single person's death. And their horizon was not a lifetime, it was the family across generations. That last difference is the one I would underline. The reason buying a single house in your own name caps out where it does is not that the house is a bad asset. It is that the structure is built around you, one mortal person, and it tends to die or scatter when you do. The Astors built structures meant to outlive every individual who managed them. So, what can an ordinary person actually take from this today legally? I want to be careful here because this is exactly the place where it would be easy to slide into telling you what to do. And I am not your attorney, and this is not advice for your situation. What I can do is name the tools that exist and tell you the kind of professional who handles them. Take this to a licensed estate planning attorney in your own state and let them tell you what fits your life. The first tool is the land trust, a legal arrangement in which a trustee holds title to real estate on behalf of beneficiaries. In some states, it keeps the owner's name off the public record and makes transferring the property simpler than a traditional sale. The second is holding real estate inside a family limited liability company, an LLC, rather than in your personal name. The family members own the company owns the property, and the membership interests can be passed down over time. This is the closest common echo of what the Astors did with estate structures, separating the human being from the asset. The third idea is the long-term lease itself. A family can own land and lease it to an operating entity or to a builder, keeping the dirt while letting someone else carry the building, exactly the split the Astors used. Now, the honest part, these structures cost money to set up properly, often several $1,000s in legal fees, sometimes more, and they carry ongoing filing and maintenance costs. Done wrong, they create problems instead of solving them, which is why this belongs with a qualified estate planning attorney and a tax professional and not with a video. The point of telling you any of it is not so you copy a dynasty. It is so you understand that the wealthiest families have always treated the legal wrapper around an asset as more important than the asset itself. The house is the easy part. The structure that holds it across time is the part they paid attention to, and the part most people never think about at all. So let me close where I began, 2 blocks from a building whose ground has not changed hands in almost 2 centuries. The lesson the Astors leave behind is not really about real estate. It is about patience and about ownership being a structure, not a feeling. Most of us are taught to chase the house, the visible thing, the part you can stand inside. The old money chased the dirt, the invisible thing, the part that does not decay, and then it built structures designed to hold that dirt long after any single owner was gone. You do not need an island in Manhattan to use the idea. You need to understand the difference between owning a thing and owning the right structure around a thing, and to ask the right professional the right question. If this changed the way you look at a deed, tell me in the comments what building near you might be sitting on leased ground. Because once you start looking, you find them everywhere. And before you go, I want to set up where we are headed next. The Astors held land by refusing to sell it, but they did it mostly in one city. The next family I want to show you went further. They built a foundation, a legal nonprofit structure that came to hold ownership stakes in companies and assets across entire countries in a way that was designed to outlast not just a person, but borders themselves. That is the Ford story, and it is stranger than the Astors. I will see you there.